Karen ran an extension cord over my fence, so I hooked it to a breaker trap and let the sparks fly. My name is Daniel. I am 43 years old. I have lived in the same house on Maplewood Drive for 11 years. 11 years of mowing my own lawn, painting my own fence, fixing my own gutters, and minding my own business. I am the kind of neighbor who waves when he sees you pulling into your driveway. I am the kind of neighbor who brings your garbage cans back from the curb if I notice they have been sitting there for 2 days. I am the kind of neighbor who, for 11 years, never once caused a single problem for anyone on this street. And then Sandra Kowalski moved in next door. Sandra moved into the house on my right side 3 years ago. From the very first week, I knew something was different about her. Not different in an interesting way, different in the way that a thunderstorm is different from a sunny day. The moment she arrived, the entire atmosphere of Maplewood Drive shifted. The air got heavier, the quiet got louder, and every single neighbor within a 4-house radius started walking a little faster when they heard her front door open. Sandra was what people politely call a strong personality. What she actually was a woman who had decided somewhere along the line that the entire neighborhood existed for her personal satisfaction, and that everyone living in it was either a useful tool or an obstacle to be removed. She was the kind of person who did not ask for things. She demanded them. She did not suggest. She declared. She did not knock on your door. She pounded on it like she owned the building. Within her first month on Maplewood Drive, Sandra had already filed 3 complaints with the HOA. One against old Mr. Patterson for parking his truck 2 inches over the property line. One against the young couple at number 14 because their wind chimes were, according to Sandra, a noise violation. And one against me because the color of my mailbox post was slightly different from the approved shade listed in the HOA guidelines, not the mailbox itself, the post, the color. Off by what the HOA inspector later told me was, quote, a negligible variation that falls well within acceptable range. Sandra did not accept that determination. She appealed it twice. I want you to understand something about Sandra before I tell you the rest of this story. She was not a stupid woman. That was actually the most dangerous thing about her. Stupid people cause chaos through ignorance. Sandra caused chaos through precision. She knew the HOA rulebook better than the people who wrote it. She knew exactly which clauses overlapped, which loopholes existed, and exactly how far she could push any given rule before it technically became a violation. She was a tactician. She treated suburban living like a chess game, and she had decided that everyone on Maplewood Drive was a pawn. I stayed out of her way for the first year. That was my strategy. Keep my head down, maintain my property, smile and wave, and let her find someone else to focus on. For a while, it actually worked. She spent most of year 1 going after the family across the street because their basketball hoop was installed 1 foot too close to the sidewalk. That battle consumed about 7 months of her energy, and during those 7 months, I lived in relative peace. But peace on Maplewood Drive under Sandra's reign was always temporary, always conditional. It lasted exactly as long as she was busy bothering someone else. Year 2 is when she started turning her attention toward me in earnest. It started small, the way these things always do. She began commenting on my fence. The fence was 6 years old when Sandra moved in, and it had been approved by the HOA, built to code, and maintained consistently every single year. It was a wooden privacy fence, 6 feet tall, running along the property line between her yard and mine. It was perfectly functional. It was perfectly legal. Sandra had a problem with it anyway. Her first complaint was that one of the fence boards on her side had a small knot in the wood that she claimed was aesthetically displeasing. I replaced the board. Her second complaint was that the post caps on her side of the fence were a slightly different height than the ones on my side. I measured every single post cap, and they were uniform to within a 1/16 of an inch. The HOA dismissed that complaint too. Her third complaint was that the fence was casting a shadow over her garden bed in the afternoon, and she wanted me to lower it by 8 inches. I did not lower the fence. That was apparently the wrong decision, because from that point forward, Sandra declared open war on Daniel Morrison and everything within 6 feet of his property line. The incidents escalated over the following months in ways I could not have predicted. She began standing at her window and photographing my yard at random intervals. I would look out and see a camera lens pointing in my direction at 7 in the morning. She started parking her car exactly 1 inch closer to my driveway every single day, a slow creep that I had to document with measurements and photos before the HOA would acknowledge it. She complained about my dog barking even on days when my dog was at the vet and physically not in the house. When I pointed this out with vet records, she claimed the barking was coming from a dog that looked like mine. She started leaving notes in my mailbox, not threatening notes, technically polite notes. The kind of notes that are written in pleasant language but carry an undercurrent of menace that makes your stomach tighten when you read them. Dear Daniel, I noticed your sprinklers came on at 6:04 this morning. Per HOA Bylaw 12(7)(b), watering should not begin before 6:00 a.m. or after 10:00 p.m. While 6:04 is within the permitted window, the spray pattern appears to reach the sidewalk, which may be a concern worth addressing at your earliest convenience. Warmly, Sandra. That was a real note. I kept it. I kept all of them. By the end of year 2, I had a folder with 47 notes from Sandra Kowalski. 47, in 12 months, that is nearly 4 notes per month. Some weeks had 3 in them. My wife Carol wanted me to move. She said the stress was not worth it, that we could find another neighborhood, that no house was worth living next to someone like Sandra. I understood why she felt that way. I watched the tension in Carol's shoulders every time Sandra's car pulled into the driveway next door. I watched my wife, who was one of the warmest and most patient people I had ever known, flinch at the sound of a car door closing. But I had built something on Maplewood Drive. 11 years of something, my garden, my workshop in the garage, the oak tree in the backyard that I had planted from a sapling when we first moved in and that was now taller than the roofline. I had roots in this place, literally and figuratively, and I refused to be pushed out by someone who had arrived 3 years ago and decided she owned the block. So I stayed, and I started preparing. The first thing I did was go through the HOA rulebook myself, all of it, cover to cover, twice. I cross-referenced every bylaw Sandra had ever used against me and identified every single rule that she herself might be in violation of. It took 3 weekends. By the end of it, I had a list of 14 potential violations visible from the property line, including the height of her decorative fence posts, the placement of her outdoor furniture, the species of one of her garden plants, which was listed as invasive under county ordinance, and the fact that her outdoor security light was pointed at an angle that technically swept across my property for approximately 45 minutes each morning as the sun moved. I did not file any of these complaints. Not yet. I held them. I held them the way you hold a hand of cards at a poker table when you are waiting for exactly the right moment to lay them down. That was January. By March, things had escalated to a level I had not anticipated. It started with the power situation. Sandra had an outdoor party set up on her back patio that she used from spring through fall, string lights, a small outdoor refrigerator, a portable sound system, all of it powered by a single heavy-duty extension cord that ran from an outlet on the back of her house. The setup itself was fine. The problem was what happened in March when she decided she wanted to rearrange her patio, and the cord was no longer quite long enough to reach her preferred arrangement. Rather than buying a longer cord or installing an additional outdoor outlet, Sandra Kowalski ran her extension cord over my fence. I want to be specific about what I mean. She did not ask me, she did not knock on my door, she did not leave a note, which was ironic given her 47-note history. She simply, at some point during a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, draped her orange heavy-duty extension cord over the top of my 6-foot privacy fence, ran it down my side, across approximately 3 feet of my yard, and plugged it into my exterior outlet on the back of my house. I discovered this when I came home from work that evening and noticed the cord running along my fence. I followed it. I found my exterior outlet. I found her cord plugged into it. I stood there in my backyard for a full minute just looking at it because I genuinely could not process what I was seeing. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accident. This was a person who had looked at my property, my fence, my outlet, and made a conscious, deliberate decision to use them as her own without asking, without permission, without any acknowledgement that they did not belong to her. I unplugged the cord, I pulled it off my fence, I coiled it up and left it on her side of the property line. The next morning, the cord was back, over my fence, plugged into my outlet. I unplugged it again. This time I also took photographs, date and time stamped. I sent a written notice to Sandra via certified mail, informing her that her cord had been removed from my property and that any future unauthorized use of my electrical outlet would be reported to the HOA and, if necessary, to the appropriate authorities, as unauthorized use of someone else's utilities is not a trivial matter. She received that letter on a Thursday. I have the delivery confirmation. On Friday morning, the cord was back, over my fence, plugged into my outlet, and this time she had used zip ties to attach it to the top of my fence boards, as if that would somehow make it more permanent. Carol saw it first. She came to get me in the kitchen where I was making coffee, and her face had that particular expression she only gets when something has genuinely pushed her past the point of frustration into something colder and more serious. She said, "Daniel, you need to come outside." I went outside, I saw the cord, I saw the zip ties. I stood there with my coffee cup in my hand, and I made a decision. I was done being reasonable. Not done being legal, not done being smart, just done being the person who absorbs hit after hit and responds with certified letters and polite requests and documented complaints filed through proper channels while the other person keeps escalating as if nothing I do carries any weight at all. I was going to handle this, but I was going to handle it correctly, completely, finally. The first thing I did was call my brother-in-law Marcus, who is an electrician with 22 years of experience and a particular fondness for what he calls elegant solutions to annoying problems. I explained the situation. I told him what Sandra had been doing. I told him about the cord, the zip ties, the 47 notes, the 2 years of calculated harassment. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You want to teach her a lesson she will never forget without doing anything she can actually sue you for?" I said yes, that was exactly what I wanted. Marcus said, "Give me the weekend." Marcus came over that Saturday with his tools and a very specific piece of equipment that he explained to me in detail. He installed, at my exterior outlet, a GFCI breaker with a remote trip switch. For people who are not familiar with how this works, let me explain. A GFCI, which stands for Ground Fault Circuit Interrupter, is a safety device that cuts power to an outlet the instant it detects any irregularity in the electrical current. They are standard safety equipment. Every bathroom and kitchen outlet in a modern home has one. They are completely legal. They are, in fact, required by code in many installations. What Marcus installed was a GFCI with an added feature, a remote trip, meaning I could, from inside my house, using a small remote about the size of a car key fob, trigger the GFCI to cut power to that outlet instantly. No damage to any equipment, no electrical hazard, just an immediate, total, and complete shutdown of power to anything plugged into that outlet. He also did one other thing. He adjusted the outlet housing so that when Sandra's cord was plugged in and the GFCI tripped, the release mechanism would cause the cord's plug to be physically ejected from the outlet. Not violently, not dangerously, just firmly enough that the plug would pop out and fall to the ground. It was, as Marcus described it, a polite but very clear message delivered in the language Sandra had chosen to speak. We tested it twice. It worked perfectly both times. Clean trip, immediate power cut, plug released, cord falls. No sparks in the dangerous sense. What happened was actually more like a sharp pop and a small flash at the moment of disconnection, the entirely normal and harmless phenomenon that occurs when any high-draw appliance is suddenly disconnected from power. Dramatic looking, completely safe, completely legal. Marcus looked at his work with the satisfied expression of a craftsman admiring a finished piece. He said, "Now you wait." I waited. Sunday passed. Sandra's cord was still over my fence and plugged into my outlet. I did not touch it. I let it sit there. I made sure Carol knew what was happening so she would not be alarmed. I also set up my outdoor security camera, which I had installed 6 months earlier after one of Sandra's late-night note deliveries had started happening in darkness, to record the back fence line in continuous mode. Monday morning, I am at the kitchen table at 6:15 a.m., drinking my first cup of coffee and watching the backyard camera feed on my laptop. Sandra's back patio lights are on. Her outdoor refrigerator is humming. Her sound system is playing something I cannot quite identify from this distance. I pick up the remote. I press the button. From inside my kitchen I hear it, a sharp crack, like a single hand clap, coming from the direction of the back fence. Through the camera feed I see the exact moment of disconnection. The patio lights on Sandra's side go dark. The refrigerator stops. The music cuts off mid-note. And the orange extension cord, freed from the outlet, drops from my fence and lands in a coiled heap on my side of the property line. For 3 seconds, nothing happens. Then Sandra Kowalski comes out of her back door. She is wearing a purple bathrobe and holding a coffee mug, and she is looking at her patio with an expression of pure bafflement. She looks at the lights. She looks at the refrigerator. She looks at the sound system. She looks at the fence. She does not yet understand what has happened. She walks to the fence. She looks over. She sees her cord on the ground on my side. And then she looks up and sees me standing at my back window, coffee cup in hand, watching her. I raised my cup in a small, polite salute. Sandra Kowalski's face went through approximately 4 distinct emotional phases in the span of about 2 seconds. Confusion, realization, outrage, and then something that I can only describe as the expression of a person who has just discovered that the game they thought they were winning has rules they did not know existed. She pointed at me. She said something I could not hear through the glass. I smiled. I took a sip of my coffee. She went back inside. I went back to my coffee. 20 minutes later, the cord was back over my fence. She had climbed up on something, reached over, retrieved her cord from my side, run it back over, and plugged it back into my outlet. I know because I watched the whole thing on camera. I waited until her patio setup was fully running again. Lights on, refrigerator humming, music playing. Then I pressed the button again. Crack, darkness, silence, cord on the ground. I did this 4 times that Monday. 4 times she ran the cord back. 4 times I tripped the breaker. By the 4th time I could see on the camera that she was not just baffled anymore. She was furious. She was packing her patio. She was on her phone. She was gesturing at my fence with the kind of full-body anger that only comes from someone who is used to getting their way and has suddenly, inexplicably, stopped getting it. I pressed the button a 5th time just because I could, and then I went to work. When I came home that evening, there was a note in my mailbox. This one was different from the previous 47. The previous 47 had been in Sandra's characteristic style, technically polite, formally structured, with references to specific HOA bylaws and careful measured language designed to sound reasonable while delivering a threat. This note was none of those things. This note said, "You tampered with my equipment. I will be reporting this to the HOA, to the city, and to my attorney. You have no right to interfere with my property. Expect to hear from me officially." I read it twice. I photographed it. I put it in the folder with the other 47. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote my response. My response was 3 pages long. It included the date and time of Sandra's first unauthorized use of my outlet, confirmed with the security camera timestamp. It included a copy of the certified mail notice I had sent her, with the delivery confirmation receipt. It included photographs of her cord zip-tied to my fence. It included a citation of the relevant statute regarding unauthorized use of another person's utilities. It included a note from Marcus, typed on his company letterhead, confirming that the GFCI device installed on my outlet was a standard safety device installed in full compliance with all applicable electrical codes, and that no tampering of any kind had occurred with Sandra's equipment, as her equipment had at no point been modified, damaged, or interfered with in any way. The power interruption was a function of my own outlet on my own property. I mailed it to her the next morning, certified, Return receipt requested. And then things got genuinely interesting. Sandra did file a complaint with the HOA. She filed it on a Wednesday, and the HOA scheduled a review for the following Monday. I attended. Sandra attended. She brought a folder of her own. I brought my folder, which was now 48 notes thick, plus the 3 pages of documentation I had compiled. The HOA board consisted of 3 people. Gerald Marsh, who had been on the board for 9 years, and had the patient, resigned expression of a man who had heard every possible neighborhood dispute and been surprised by none of them. Patricia Lynn, who took meticulous minutes and had once, at a particularly contentious meeting, removed her glasses and pressed them to her forehead in what appeared to be a brief silent prayer. A new board member, Tom Decker, who was 32 years old and had joined the board 6 months ago with genuine enthusiasm, and was now beginning to understand why the previous board members had all resigned, citing personal reasons. Sandra presented her case first. She claimed that I had installed a device specifically designed to interfere with her property. She claimed this constituted harassment. She claimed that the disruption to her patio setup had caused distress and inconvenience. She produced a printed diagram of my fence and her patio arrangement, with arrows indicating the path of her extension cord, as if she were presenting evidence in a federal trial. Gerald Marsh looked at the diagram. He looked at Sandra. He said very carefully, "Mrs. Kowalski, can I ask a clarifying question before we go further? This diagram shows the cord running from your patio over the shared fence and into an outlet on Mr. Morrison's property. Is that correct?" Sandra said yes. Gerald said, "And had Mr. Morrison given you permission to use that outlet?" There was a pause. Sandra said that she had been using it for several weeks, and he had never said anything, which she interpreted as implied consent. Gerald looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at her minutes. Tom Decker looked at the ceiling. Gerald said, "Mrs. Kowalski, I think we may be approaching this from the wrong direction." That was the moment I knew the HOA hearing was going to go exactly the way I needed it to go. I presented my documentation, the certified letter, the delivery receipt, the camera timestamps, the photographs of the zip ties, the note from Marcus. I laid it out in order, chronologically, clearly, the way you present something when you have spent 3 years learning to document everything because you knew this moment was eventually going to come. Gerald Marsh listened to all of it with his characteristic patience. When I finished, he looked at Sandra and said, "Mrs. Kowalski, based on the documentation presented here, it appears that Mr. Morrison's outlet is on his property, that he notified you in writing that he did not consent to its use, that you continued to use it after receiving that notification, and that the interruption of power you experienced was a function of a legally installed safety device on his own property. I'm not sure what remedy you're asking the board to provide." Sandra said she wanted me to be required to keep my outlet accessible to her. She actually said those words. She wanted the HOA to compel me to allow her to use my electricity. Tom Decker made a sound that was technically a cough, but was almost certainly not a cough. Gerald said that was not something the HOA had any authority or inclination to require. He said that if Sandra needed additional power for her patio, she should consult a licensed electrician about installing an additional outdoor outlet on her own property. He recommended Marcus. I had actually prepared for this possibility and had Marcus's business card ready. I slid it across the table. Sandra looked at the business card. She looked at me. She looked at Gerald. She picked up her folder and her diagram, and she left the meeting. The board ruled in my favor. The full written ruling came 4 days later. It stated that no violation of any HOA bylaw had been identified on my part, that the use of a GFCI safety device on my own property was entirely within my rights as a homeowner, and that Mrs. Kowalski was formally reminded that the unauthorized use of a neighbor's utilities without explicit consent was not a practice the HOA could endorse or protect. I framed that ruling. I hung it in my garage workshop between my table saw and my drill press. Carol thought I was being petty. She was correct. I did not care even slightly. But here is the thing about Sandra Kowalski. a normal person, after losing an HOA hearing that they had initiated themselves over a complaint that had essentially amounted to asking for the legal right to steal someone else's electricity, would perhaps take a step back, reassess, consider the possibility that they had overstepped, dial it back. Sandra was not a normal person. Sandra Kowalski interpreted the HOA ruling not as a judgment against her behavior, but as evidence of a conspiracy against her. In her worldview, the only explanation for why she had not gotten what she wanted was that Gerald Marsh, Patricia Lynn, Tom Decker, and I had somehow coordinated against her. She said this out loud. She said it to our neighbor across the street, James Whitfield, who told me about it later with the uncomfortable expression of someone who had been cornered and forced to listen to something they deeply wished they had not heard. According to James, Sandra had stood in his driveway for 20 minutes explaining that I had clearly tampered with the HOA board, that Gerald Marsh was biased because he and I had once waved to each other at the same time while checking our mail, which she described as evidence of a pre-existing relationship, and that she was preparing to escalate her complaints to the city level. James had nodded politely until she finished, and then gone inside and called me immediately. I thanked him. I updated my documentation folder. 3 days after the HOA ruling, Sandra Kowalski ran her extension cord over my fence again. I genuinely could not believe it. I stood in my backyard looking at it for a long moment. The orange cord over my fence, plugged into my outlet, after the certified letter, after the removal, after the zip ties, after the HOA hearing, after the ruling, the cord was back. I called Marcus. I said, "She did it again." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Well, I was going to suggest we upgrade anyway." And that is when Marcus came back with Phase 2. Phase 2 was not just a GFCI trip. Phase 2 was what Marcus described as a complete power management solution with enhanced response capability. What this meant in practical terms was as follows. Marcus installed a secondary breaker on a dedicated circuit for my exterior outlet, one that not only tripped instantly on command, but also, upon tripping, triggered a small but very effective strobe light mounted on the fence post above the outlet. The strobe was pointed outward, towards Sandra's yard. It was weatherproof, completely legal as an outdoor light fixture, and when it activated it, produced exactly the kind of dramatic visual effect that you might associate with, say, a professional photographer's flash unit, except sustained for about 5 seconds. He also, and this was the part that I particularly appreciated, installed a small speaker inside a weatherproof housing on the same fence post. The speaker was connected to my phone via Bluetooth, meaning that at the moment of the power trip, I could, if I chose, also play a sound through that speaker. Any sound, whatever sound I felt was most appropriate to the situation. I spent an evening choosing the sound. I considered several options. I ultimately selected a short audio clip of a single firm buzzer sound, the kind used on game shows when a contestant gets a wrong answer, followed by a calm recorded voice saying, "Access denied." I tested the whole system twice with Marcus present. GFCI trip, plug ejected, strobe activates for 5 seconds, speaker plays buzzer, and access denied. It was, objectively, the most satisfying piece of home installation work I had ever witnessed. Marcus looked at it, running in test mode, and said, "I should have gone into theatrical electronics instead of residential wiring." I said, "You still can." We both laughed for a while. Then I waited for Sandra to come home. She ran the cord over the fence on a Thursday evening. I watched it happen on the camera. She draped it over, walked it to the outlet, plugged it in. Her patio lights came on. Her refrigerator hummed to life. Her sound system started playing what I now recognized as her Thursday evening playlist, a mix of adult contemporary that she apparently enjoyed while reading on her patio. I gave it 20 minutes. Let her get settled. Let her pour herself a glass of wine and open her book and relax into her Thursday evening on a patio powered by electricity that was not hers. Then I pressed the button. The strobe lit up the entire back fence line with 5 seconds of rapid white light. The speaker barked the buzzer sound across both yards with perfect clarity in the still evening air. Access denied. The plug hit the ground. The patio went dark and silent. I watched the camera. Sandra's book fell off her chair. She stood up so fast her wine glass rocked on the table. She grabbed it. She looked at the fence. She looked at the strobe, which was now dark again. She looked at the cord on the ground on my side. She looked at the fence post where the speaker was mounted. Her face was, based on what I could see on the camera feed, cycling through emotions faster than I could catalogue them. I pressed the button one more time, not because the cord was still plugged in, it was not, but because Marcus had included a standalone test function on the remote. The strobe lit up again. The buzzer sounded again. Access denied. Sandra Kowalski actually stepped backward, 2 full steps, as if the fence had spoken to her directly and she had not been prepared for that conversation. I allowed myself, alone in my kitchen, 1 full minute of genuine laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and releases something that has been built up for a very long time. Then I composed myself and went back to watching the camera. Sandra did not retrieve her cord that evening. She went back inside. Her patio stayed dark. Her Thursday evening playlist did not resume. The next morning, there was a note in my mailbox. This one did not reference HOA bylaws. Sandra's note the next morning was the shortest one she had ever written me. All 48 previous notes had been carefully structured paragraphs with formal salutations and specific references to rules and regulations. This one was 4 sentences. What you have installed on that fence is harassment equipment. It is designed specifically to target me, and it is causing me emotional distress. I have consulted an attorney, and I have been advised that I have grounds for a civil claim. You will be hearing from my legal representation. I read it standing at the end of my driveway in my work clothes with my travel mug in my hand. I read it twice. I put it in my coat pocket. I drove to work. During my lunch break, I called my own attorney, a woman named Deborah Chen, who I had met 3 years ago at a neighborhood association event, and who had, over the course of our professional relationship, become the person I called whenever Sandra had escalated something to a level I could not handle with documentation alone. I told Deborah everything. The cord, the outlet, the GFCI, the strobe, the speaker, the HOA hearing, the ruling, and the new note. Deborah listened. She asked 2 questions. First, was the strobe pointed in any direction that could be considered a traffic hazard or a direct window beam into Sandra's house? I said no, it was pointed at her backyard. Second, was any of the installed equipment in violation of any HOA bylaw or city ordinance? I said no, Marcus had specifically checked both before installation. Deborah said, then you're fine. What she's describing isn't a viable civil claim. A strobe light on a fence post that activates briefly when someone unauthorized uses your outlet is not harassment equipment. It's an annoyance, maybe, but annoyance isn't actionable. Her attorney, if she actually has one, will tell her the same thing. She paused and then added, that said, if you want to be truly bulletproof here, there's one more thing you could do that would essentially close every remaining door she has. I asked what it was. Deborah said, post a sign. A sign, specifically a weatherproof sign on the fence post, clearly visible from Sandra's property, stating that the outlet was on private property and that unauthorized use was prohibited and subject to legal action. Standard trespass language. The moment that sign went up, any claim Sandra made about implied consent or lack of notice became legally impossible to sustain. You cannot claim you didn't know something was prohibited when there is a sign directly in your eyeline telling you it is prohibited. I had the sign made at a print shop that afternoon, weatherproof aluminum, black text on white background, professional and completely unambiguous. I installed it the next morning. Then I called Marcus and told him to leave the system exactly as it was. 2 days passed. Sandra did not run the cord. I watched the camera each morning and evening, and the fence remained clear. For 48 hours, Maplewood Drive was the quietest it had been in 3 years. Carol noticed it too. She mentioned over dinner on the second evening that she had not felt her shoulders tighten when Sandra's car pulled in that afternoon. She said it almost like she was surprised by it, like the absence of tension was itself something remarkable enough to comment on. I did not want to jinx it. I did not say anything except that things seemed to be settling down. They were not settling down. On the third day, Sandra changed tactics. I came home from work to find that she had trimmed my oak tree, not asked, not discussed, not filed a request through the HOA, which would have required a formal process and my consent. She had simply at some point during the afternoon gotten a ladder and pruned 3 branches from my oak tree that extended over the property line into her yard. The branches were on her side of the line, so technically, by a specific and narrow reading of property law, she had the right to trim them. What she did not have the right to do was what she had done with them. She had stacked them against my fence, on my side. She had somehow gotten them over the fence and arranged them in a deliberate pile against my fence boards, taking up 3 feet of my garden bed and crushing 2 of Carol's rose bushes that had been growing there for 4 years. Carol saw the rose bushes first. I heard her from the driveway. I went around the back and found her standing in the garden, looking at the crushed plants with an expression I had not seen on her face in 11 years of marriage. It was the expression of someone who has been patient beyond what patience should require and has reached a place on the other side of patience that does not have a polite name. Carol turned to me and said, in a very quiet and very calm voice, "Daniel, finish it." I took photographs of the branches. I took photographs of the crushed rose bushes. I measured the pile. I confirmed the branches were from my oak tree by matching the leaf structure and the bark. I called Deborah. She told me that while Sandra had the right to trim branches on her side, she absolutely did not have the right to deposit the trimmed material on my property, that this constituted illegal dumping of yard waste on private property and was a separate matter from the branch trimming question entirely. I filed 3 things simultaneously: a complaint with the HOA for the yard waste deposit and destruction of my garden plantings, a complaint with the City Public Works Department for illegal yard waste dumping, and a formal written demand to Sandra, sent certified mail, for reimbursement of the value of the 2 destroyed rose bushes, documented with purchase receipts I found in my garden records, plus the cost of replacement planting. The rose bushes had originally cost $62 each. With labor and replacement plants, the demand was $410. While I was doing all of this, Marcus came over because I had called him about an unrelated matter, but told him what had happened with the tree branches. He walked around the back, looked at the situation, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what this is, right?" I said yes. I said this was Sandra realizing that she could not beat me on the electrical outlet front and attempting to open a second front where she thought she had more legal standing. Marcus said, "She is going to keep opening new fronts until she runs out of them or until something makes it not worth it anymore." I said I was working on the something. And I was, because over the previous 2 weeks, while all of this was happening, I had also been doing something that Sandra did not know about. I had been quietly talking to my neighbors. Not gossiping, not campaigning, not organizing anything that could be characterized as a group action against one resident, which Deborah had specifically advised me to avoid since it could potentially expose me to a counter-harassment claim. What I had been doing was listening. Every neighbor who approached me about Sandra got my full attention and careful documentation. James Whitfield across the street, the Petersons at number 12. Maria Gonzalez at number 18, who had been fighting Sandra over a property line dispute for 8 months. Old Mr. Patterson, who was still dealing with the aftermath of the parking complaint from Sandra's first month on the street. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them had documentation of their own. Most of them had never thought to file a formal complaint because they did not know you could, or because they had assumed no one would listen, or because they were simply exhausted by the idea of engaging with Sandra on any level. I gave them Deborah's number. I gave them the HOA complaint form link. I told them to document everything, date and timestamp it, and file it formally rather than letting it sit in a folder. Within 3 weeks, the HOA had received 11 new formal complaints from 6 different residents on Maplewood Drive, all pertaining to incidents involving Sandra Kowalski. 11 complaints, 6 neighbors, 3 weeks. Gerald Marsh called me, not officially, personally. He said, "Daniel, I want you to know that what's happening right now is creating a situation that the board needs to address in a more formal way than individual complaint review." I said I understood. He said there's a mechanism in the HOA bylaws for this kind of pattern. It's rarely invoked. It requires a formal board review of a resident's overall conduct history rather than individual incidents. The threshold for triggering this review is a pattern of substantiated complaints from multiple residents within a calendar year. I said, "How many complaints is the threshold?" Gerald said, 8. We had 11. Gerald said the board would be scheduling a formal conduct review hearing for the following month. He said I would be notified along with all other involved parties. He said the potential outcomes of a conduct review hearing ranged from a formal written warning with conditions, to mandatory mediation, to, in extreme cases, financial penalties, and a formal referral to the HOA's legal counsel for consideration of further action. I thanked him. I went and told Carol. Carol sat down at the kitchen table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think it will actually matter to her?" I said I did not know. I said it depended on whether Sandra was more invested in winning than in staying on Maplewood Drive. Carol said, "She has no idea this is coming, does she?" I said no. As far as Sandra knew, she was still playing offense. She had no idea that while she had been focused on extension cords and tree branches and outdoor lights, I had been building a case that went far beyond my own property line. The next morning, Sandra ran the cord over the fence again. I know I could not believe it either. The sign was right there. The strobe system was right there. The HOA ruling was on record. The conduct review had been scheduled. And Sandra Kowalski ran her extension cord over my fence and plugged it into my outlet at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning like none of it had happened. I watched it on camera. I watched her drape it over, run it down my side, plug it in. I watched her go back inside. I watched her patio lights come on and her refrigerator start running. I sat with the remote in my hand for a moment. Then I thought about something Deborah had said during our last call. She had said, "At some point, Daniel, you want this to stop being a private back and forth and start being a documented public pattern, because the more she does this in the face of explicit notice, the clearer the picture becomes." I put the remote down. I called the non-emergency police line instead. I explained the situation to the dispatcher. I explained that I had a documented case of ongoing unauthorized use of my private electrical outlet, that I had issued written notice via certified mail, that the HOA had ruled on the matter in my favor, that a formal conduct review had been scheduled, and that the unauthorized use was happening again right now, and I had camera footage of it in real time. The dispatcher sent a patrol officer. Officer Reyes arrived 20 minutes later. I showed him my documentation. I showed him the camera footage. I showed him the sign on the fence post. I walked him around to my backyard and showed him Sandra's orange extension cord running from her property over my fence and into my outlet. Officer Reyes looked at the cord. He looked at the sign. He looked at me. He said, "This has been going on a while." I said yes. He said, "And she's received written notice." I showed him the certified mail receipt. He said, "And the HOA has ruled on it." I showed him the ruling. He knocked on Sandra's door. I watched from my driveway at a respectful distance while Officer Reyes spoke to Sandra on her front porch. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see the body language. Sandra started the conversation standing tall with her arms crossed, the posture she used when she was preparing to be the most reasonable person in the room. Halfway through the conversation, her arms uncrossed. By the end, her hands were at her sides, and she was looking at Officer Reyes, with the expression I had been waiting 3 years to see on Sandra Kowalski's face. The expression of someone who has finally run out of moves. Officer Reyes came back to me. He said he had explained the situation to Sandra and that she had agreed to remove the cord immediately. He said no citation would be issued at this time, but that the contact would be logged and that any future incident could be followed up with a formal citation for unauthorized use of private utilities. He gave me a case number. I thanked him. I watched Sandra come around to the back of her house and remove the cord from my fence for what I was now fairly confident would be the last time. She did not look at me while she did it. I did not say anything. I went back inside and updated my documentation folder with the case number. The HOA conduct review hearing took place on a Thursday evening in the community room of the Maplewood Neighborhood Association building. It was, by any measure, the most attended HOA meeting in the 9-year tenure of Gerald Marsh as board chair. 14 residents showed up. The room held 20 chairs. Every chair was filled. Sandra arrived in a charcoal gray blazer carrying a briefcase. She had prepared. She had clearly spent significant time preparing. She had color-coded tabs on her documents and what appeared to be a structured presentation format. She sat down at the respondent's table and arranged her materials with the methodical efficiency of someone who still believed that being the most organized person in the room was the same as being right. Gerald Marsh opened the hearing. He read the formal statement of purpose, which was to review the conduct record of Sandra Kowalski as a resident of the Maplewood HOA community based on a pattern of substantiated complaints submitted by multiple residents within a single calendar year. He noted that this was only the third formal conduct review in the association's 21-year history. He went through the complaints one by one. Each complaint was read into the record. The responding resident was identified by number rather than name for procedural reasons, and Sandra was given the opportunity to respond to each one. She responded to every single one. She had a counter-argument for every complaint, a context that she felt reframed each incident, a procedural objection, or an alternative interpretation for every piece of evidence. She was, as she always was, precise, organized, prepared, and completely unable to grasp that the issue was not whether any individual complaint could be reframed or challenged. The issue was the pattern: 11 complaints, 6 neighbors. 3 years of documented incidents. Gerald Marsh was not asking Sandra to defend any one thing she had done. He was asking her to explain why, taken all together, the accumulated record of her conduct on Maplewood Drive looked the way it did. Sandra could not explain it, because to explain it honestly would require her to say something she was constitutionally incapable of saying, which was that she had made a sustained and deliberate choice to treat her neighbors as obstacles, and that the record in front of the board was the natural result of that choice. Instead, she said the board was biased. She said the complaints were coordinated. She referenced my wave with Gerald at the mailbox, which she had apparently not forgotten, as evidence of a pre-existing conspiracy. She said that she was the victim of a neighborhood campaign orchestrated against her because she had the courage to hold residents accountable to the HOA standards that everyone else was too lazy or too cowardly to enforce. Tom Decker looked at the ceiling again. I noticed he had developed this as a consistent response to Sandra's more ambitious claims. Gerald Marsh let her finish. He waited a full 10 seconds after she stopped speaking. Then he said, in the patient, resigned voice of a man who had been doing this for 9 years, "Mrs. Kowalski, the board has heard your responses and your characterization of the events documented here. We will now deliberate." The board went into a side room. The rest of us sat in the community room. Sandra rearranged her color-coded tabs for 8 minutes. James Whitfield caught my eye from across the room and gave me a very small nod. Maria Gonzalez was looking at her hands. Mr. Patterson had his hat in his lap and was turning the brim over and over slowly. The board came back after 14 minutes. Gerald read the ruling. The board found that the documented pattern of conduct by Sandra Kowalski constituted a repeated and sustained pattern of behavior inconsistent with the community standards expected of HOA residents. that multiple complaints had been substantiated through documentation and resident testimony, and that the cumulative impact on multiple residents represented a material deterioration of community well-being that the HOA had both the authority and the responsibility to address. The ruling had three components. First, a formal written warning placed in Sandra's permanent HOA file. Second, a mandatory mediation requirement. Any future dispute with any neighbor would require a mandatory mediation session before a formal complaint could be filed, meaning Sandra could no longer weaponize the complaint process as a first strike tool. Third, a fine schedule. Any future substantiated complaint against Sandra would result in an automatic fine starting at $250 and doubling with each subsequent violation. Sandra stood up. She said the ruling was illegitimate. She said she was consulting her attorney. She said she would be appealing every component of the ruling through whatever process was available to her. Gerald said she was welcome to do so and that the appeals process was outlined on page 47 of the HOA handbook. Sandra picked up her briefcase and her color-coded presentation, and she left. The room was very quiet for a moment after she left. Then Mr. Patterson, who had been turning his hat brim for the entire hearing, put his hat back on his head and said, in the mild voice of a man who chooses his words carefully because he does not use many of them, "Well, that was a long time coming." Several people laughed. The tension in the room broke like a wave. Gerald Marsh allowed himself a small smile. Patricia Lynn finished her minutes. Tom Decker looked at the ceiling one final time, but this time it was a different kind of look. This time it looked like relief. I want to tell you what happened after, because the story does not end with the hearing. Life with a neighbor like Sandra does not end with a ruling or a case number or a formal warning. It does not end cleanly. It ends the way most real things end, gradually, messily, in increments rather than all at once. Sandra appealed the HOA ruling. The appeals process took 6 weeks and resulted in the ruling being upheld in full with one minor modification. The fine schedule starting point was adjusted to $300 instead of $250, which was not the modification Sandra had been hopping for. She filed a complaint with the city over my strobe light. A city inspector came, looked at the installation, confirmed it was within all applicable ordinances, and closed the complaint. She did consult an attorney about the civil harassment claim. The attorney, apparently, told her the same thing Deborah had told me, that a strobe light on a fence post activated by an outlet safety device did not constitute actionable harassment. She did not file the claim. The extension cord never came back over my fence. Not once. Not in the 4 months between the police visit and the date I am telling you this story. The orange cord disappeared from my sight line entirely, and I eventually stopped checking the camera feed for it every morning. What did come back, slowly, gradually, was Maplewood Drive. Mr. Patterson started leaving his truck in the same spot he always had, the spot that was never actually a violation, without the low-level anxiety I had noticed in him for the past 2 years. The family at number 14 rehung their wind chimes, the ones Sandra had complained about, and I heard them again on windy evenings for the first time in almost a year, a sound I had not realized I had been missing. Maria Gonzalez finished her garden border project, the one Sandra had disputed for 8 months, and sent me a photograph of the finished result with a text that just said, "Finally." James Whitfield threw a small backyard gathering and invited most of the street. Sandra was not there. I did not know whether she had not been invited or had declined. I did not ask. I was just glad to stand in James's backyard on a Saturday afternoon with a cold drink and talk to my neighbors about normal things. Ordinary things. Things that had nothing to do with property lines or outlet permissions or HOA bylaws. Carol came with me. At one point during the afternoon I looked over and she was laughing at something Maria had said. A real laugh, unguarded and easy, the way she used to laugh before a thunderstorm moved in next door. I watched her for a moment. Then I went and stood next to her, and she put her arm through mine without looking up from the conversation she was in, and I thought, this is what it was always supposed to feel like. This is what I was protecting when I refused to move. I want to close with something honest, because I think these stories have a tendency to become simple when the reality is more complicated. Sandra Kowalski is still on Maplewood Drive. She is still in the house next door. We do not speak. We do not wave. When we are both outside at the same time, there is a silence between us that has its own weight and texture, something between a ceasefire and a standoff. I do not know what she thinks about all of it now. I do not know whether she has reflected on what the previous 3 years cost her in terms of relationships and reputation and goodwill on a street where she is going to be living for however many more years. I do not know whether any part of her understands that she did this to herself. What I know is that the fence is still there, my outlet is still there, the sign is still there, the GFCI is still there, Marcus's system is still installed and functional, though I have not had reason to use it in months. My oak tree is growing. Carol's rose bushes, the replacements for the ones Sandra crushed, are established now and bloomed last spring. And my documentation folder, all 48 notes plus all the certifieds and the HOA rulings and the police case number and the conduct review decision, is in the top drawer of my filing cabinet, where it will stay as long as Sandra Kowalski is living next door to me on Maplewood Drive. Because the thing about someone like Sandra is that you never fully close the book. You just get to a chapter where the story settles, where the energy she brings stops finding purchase in your life, where the weight of her attention can no longer move you. You do not forget what it cost to get here. You do not pretend it was not hard, or that it did not wear on you in ways you are still quietly working through. You just keep your documentation. You keep your sign on the fence post. You keep your remote on the kitchen counter. And you let the wind chimes down the street play.